Hey guys, my name is Trevor Sullivan, and welcome back to my video channel. Thank you so much for joining me on another video that we're going to be covering with Windmill. So Windmill, if you're new to it and you're just watching this video for the first time, kind of out of the blue, Windmill is essentially an open source platform that allows you to build low-code user interfaces, schedule background automation scripts, and integrate with a whole bunch of external services. In the previous video that I did on my video channel, we actually built a Windmill application that uses an SSH connection with some very basic Python code in order to build a virtual machine management interface directly inside of the Windmill platform. So this is available over at github.com/windmill-labs/windmill. As you can see, it's a very popular project with over 5,000 stars on GitHub and growing on a regular basis. So the sky is really the limit as far as what you can build with Windmill. And we're going to be actually taking a look at a different integration today where we can actually gather data from a form inside of a Windmill user interface and then inject that data into a PostgreSQL database. So what we're going to do is actually use a PostgreSQL database. We're going to spin it up in Docker. Then we're going to build a simple user interface in Windmill. And every time that we click a button, it's going to write a new record into that PostgreSQL database. Now, before we get too far into the topic here, we are going to take a look at my channel here really quick. It's youtube.com/Trevor Sullivan, and you can go ahead and subscribe here. And if you do, you'll see there's a whole bunch of playlists available. There's a playlist for Windmill.dev. There's a playlist for LXD virtualization to create virtual machines and containers on Ubuntu Linux servers. There's a more generic open source software one that contains a variety of different open source topics. There's PowerShell automation, Amazon Web Services, and a lot more videos to come. So feel free to subscribe. Plus, if you go over to the community tab right here, you'll actually see that I've got these quiz questions where you can kind of test your knowledge, figure out if you get a question wrong, you can actually learn the answer to it, get links to documentation that provides support for those answers and things like that. So I use these quiz questions to help you figure out where you need to improve your knowledge and maybe jostle your mind with some new ideas. All right, so what we're going to do is build a application in Windmill that's substantially similar to this. As you can see, we've got a simple customer management application right here. We have a first name field, a last name field that we can type into, and then we also have this birth date, although we're not going to include that because I'm trying to figure out in the native Postgres support how to convert a date to a Postgres data type inside of our scripts. But what we're going to do is just to use the first name and last name fields here. We'll type in some values for that data. We'll click on Add New Customer, and that's going to write a record into our database. So right over here, I'm using this free and open source software called Beekeeper Studio to connect to a PostgreSQL database. And if I just click on this little refresh button right down here, you can see that we just added this new record into this table right here. So this helps us to just manage our customer database from a friendly user interface that we wrote using the Windmill framework. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is to actually go ahead and deploy a database server. Now, in order to do this, what I'm going to do is go ahead and spin up a virtual machine for starters, just to show you from scratch what it looks like to deploy a brand new VM. I am actually going to be using LXD for this purpose, so feel free to go watch my video series or my playlist on my YouTube channel that covers LXD if you're interested in using LXD to deploy VMs. So I'm going to go ahead and SSH into one of my bare metal LXD hosts right here, and I'm going to launch a new virtual machine to serve as our VM for running PostgreSQL databases. So I'm going to go ahead and say LXC launch --VM. I'll use the Ubuntu Lunar image, and I'll just call this Postgres 01. And I'm also going to specify that the config limits.cpu is equal to 2, and config limits.memory is equal to 2 gigabytes, just so we have a little bit of extra RAM and CPU. And then I'm also going to use profile default and profile MAC VLAN to make sure that it's attached to my physical network and that we can expose Postgres directly on the IP address that this virtual machine gets. So once this virtual machine spins up, we'll go ahead and install Docker onto this VM, and we'll also install the Postgres engine, or not really install it, but what we're going to do is use this container image here for Postgres to spin up a new Postgres engine inside of a Docker container, and we'll expose the port 5432 for Postgres onto the IP address for this VM. So let's go ahead and exec into this virtual machine so that we can get everything installed. We'll run apt update, and then we'll just install the Docker engine, which is called docker.io. That's the name of the apt package on Linux here. And again, I am using Ubuntu Lunar Lobster here, which is the latest release of Ubuntu as of right now. So we'll do apt install docker.io --yes. That'll get the Docker engine installed. Then we'll go ahead and pull the Postgres container image, and then we'll run a container from that Postgres image. Now, as we explore the documentation for the Postgres image here, we do have to make sure that we specify an environment variable that contains the Postgres password. So this is a special environment variable that you have to specify when you deploy a Postgres container to ensure that you have a unique Postgres password, a user password for that container. So let's do a docker pull Postgres. We'll just use the latest tag for now, but you could, of course, use any specific version by specifying a tag after it, such as these historical versions of Postgres right down here. But we're just going to use the latest tag to grab the latest release, which looks like it is 15.3. So as soon as we get this image downloaded, we'll just do a docker run. I'll expose all ports directly to the host network interface. I'll specify an environment variable with Postgres password, and we'll set that to Windmill.123, and then we'll specify our database container image, which is just Postgres latest. So let's go ahead and run that, and we should see that the database system is now ready to accept connections on TCP port 5432. So let's go ahead and test out connectivity to the database to make sure that it is actually accessible. So let me do Control-C here to actually stop that. And let me just start it up in detached mode. So what we should have done, let me just delete that. We'll say docker rm-f 401. And then if we rerun this command right up here, what I should have done is specify --detach. And we'd also set restart equal to always, so that if we reboot the system, it's going to automatically start up the Postgres container. All right, so let's find out the IP address of our virtual machine. So it's 10.0.0.126, and we'll go ahead and test out connectivity from Beekeeper Studio here. So we'll disconnect from our current connection, and we'll open up a new connection. We'll specify the connection type of Postgres right here, and then we'll plug in our IP address. The default port is 5432. We'll use the default user, which is Postgres, and our password should be Windmill123. So we'll click on the test button, and it looks like our connection is good. All right, so now that we have our database server up and running, we can go ahead and just create a new database here. I'll just give this name Trevor database. And then inside of our Trevor database here, we want to go ahead and create a table to hold our customer information. So what we'll do is just call this table customers, and we'll create a couple of columns in this table. So the first column will be first_name. We'll leave that at a varchar, and we'll make it non-nullable because we don't want null values for the first name. And then we'll use last_name for the last name field, and we'll uncheck nullable as well. And then finally, we'll just click on create table. So now with the Trevor database selected right up here in the top left, we should under public right here have the customers table, and we should have these two fields right here, first name and last name. Awesome. So now that we've configured our database, let's go over to Windmill, where we'll actually create the application completely from scratch. All right, so what we're going to do is head over to the Windmill user interface right here, and I'm going to create a new workspace. We'll just call this workspace customer manager. and we'll choose to create workspace. And so this is just going to be a new empty workspace where we can kind of mock out our application user interface, and then we can build the backend script, which is really simple because there's native support for Postgres scripts using the Rust programming language behind the scenes. But for starters, we'll just go to app here, and we'll give an app summary in the top left of customer manager. That's just kind of the name of our application. And now we can start building out the user interface. So let's add a text heading right here, and we'll just call this customer management app. And we can also apply some custom styling right here using Tailwind CSS. So down here under the styling for this particular component, it's just holding text. We can plug in these Tailwind classes on the far right here. And if you want to make the heading right here a little bit larger, what we can do is actually go over here and look for, I think it's under text sizes or something like that. It's actually over here under font size. So what we could do is just apply something like text-2XL, and that'll make the text a little bit bigger. So if we plug that in, you can see the text becomes a little bit bigger and it looks more like a heading. So now what we're going to do is add in a couple of input fields. So for starters, we'll add the labels for those input fields. So down here, we'll say this is going to be the first name field. So we'll say first name colon. And we also want to go ahead and just center that vertically. And we'll also right justify that so it shows up on the right. And then we can just do a Control-C, Control-V to copy and paste that. And the second one here, we'll just call this last name. And now we can add a couple of editable text fields. So once again, we'll click on the plus in the component library, add a new text input right here, put it to the right of the first name and expand it just a little bit here so it's long enough. And let's make sure that we give this a name. So we'll call this txt first name, just so we can easily identify that component. And then we'll just do a Control-C, Control-V to copy it and bring this down here. And we'll rename this one to txt last name. All right, so now that we've got that, we can add in a button here that will allow us to add a customer into our database. So our button right here we'll put underneath of our text boxes. We'll just make it a little bit wider, and we'll click on fill container right here to make that button a little bit larger. And then we'll say add new customer, and we'll put in a little person emoji so that we have a little bit of character to our application. All right, so this is looking pretty good so far. There's another styling thing that we can do though. So if we want to use a custom font in our application in Windmill, we can head over to Google Fonts at fonts.google.com. We can kind of scroll through and find a font that works for us. I'm gonna go ahead and use this fancy futuristic looking font called Tomorrow that looks pretty neat. So we're going to use that, and then we're going to look through the different font weights here. And I'm going to go ahead and just find a relatively light font weight, like maybe 300 right here. And then what we can do is import this directly into our application by using some simple CSS. So if we just search for CSS right here, let's go over to, not the download here, because we don't actually want to download it. We actually just want to click this little icon in the top right here where it says View Selected Families. And then this is going to give us the CSS to import the font right here, and then the CSS to actually use the font on different elements right down here. So copy both of those values minus these little style tags right here because we don't need those for where we're going to be putting this code. And over here in our application, we're going to go to the global styling right up here. And under the application configuration, we're going to go ahead and paste the import code right there. And then what we can do is actually set our font family to that particular font by adding in the font family setting right there. So now you can see that our font has changed all to the exact same font here. Now, something else that's cool with Tailwind CSS that we can do is to specify alternative colors for our user interface elements. So there's a default color palette that we can choose from right here. There's a whole bunch of different shades of colors that we can use. So let's say that we wanted to maybe turn our button a little bit darker of a kind of slate color right here. So I could use maybe slate 700 right here to make it a little bit darker. And then if we hover over it, we could use slate 600 instead, just to make it a little bit lighter when we hover over it. So how do we do that? Well, we'll click on our button right here, and we'll actually just give it a name first. We'll call this BTN New Customer. And over on the right-hand side with the button selected, we'll go to the styling section right here. And then under Tailwind classes, we're going to do BG for background dash slate dash 700. And as you can see, that makes our button a little bit darker. But when we hover over it, you can see it is a little bit lighter right there. But I'm actually going to do hover : BG dash slate dash 600. And that will allow us to specify exactly which color we want to use when we hover over that button there. All right, so now that we've got a little bit of styling here, let's go ahead and actually wire things up so that when we click on this button, it adds the customer into our PostgreSQL database. So what we're going to do is just do a save draft right here, and we'll also go ahead and just deploy this application. And then back over under our workspace right here, we're going to create a new script. Now, there's a lot of different languages that are natively supported by Windmill.dev for your backend scripts. However, there's actually a Postgres type here that uses the Rust programming language under the hood, but all we have to worry about is configuring our actual SQL script that we want to use to insert some values. We also need to make sure that we create a connection here. So let's go ahead and create a new connection resource to our Postgres database, and I'll just call this PGDB. And down here, we'll plug in our host, which is going to be our IP address, 10.0.0.126. The port will be the default 5432. Let me go ahead and fix that. The username is going to be the Postgres default user. The database name is the custom database that we created, which is Trevor. And then the password is going to be Windmill123. And by default, SSL is disabled, so we can just leave that for the Postgres Docker image that we used from the Docker Hub. So let's save this connection resource, and that'll be the connection that we use to execute this SQL script. All right, so now we need to take a look at the input arguments here. In these comments right up here, $1 is argument number 1, number 2 is the argument number 2. So we're just going to rename these like first name and last name, and that's just the name that shows up under these fields right over here when we actually wire up the user interface to this script. But then we can actually reference the values right here by using $1 and $2, and we're going to change the type of $2 to a text type because we are using varchar fields for both our first name and last name. And then over here where it says insert into, we need to make sure that we specify the table, and that is called customers. So let's go ahead and save a draft right here, and then we'll test out our script before we wire it up to the UI. So we'll choose our connection. We'll plug in a name like Trevor Sullivan for first and last name, and then we'll just hit test. And it looks like we're getting a little bit of an error here, probably because we need to specify our fields. So we'll say insert into customers, first underscore name, last underscore name, and then we'll specify the values right here with those variables. So let's do save draft. We'll test our script once again, and this time we didn't get any errors. So to verify everything, we'll just come back to Beekeeper Studio. We'll right-click on our customers table and say View Data. And as you can see, we've got a new record in our table here. All right, so now that we've got our database created and we've got our user interface stubbed out, we've also implemented our backend PostgreSQL script to add new records into the customers table. The last step is to simply wire up the Windmill.dev user interface elements to the PostgreSQL script. So what we'll do is back in our Windmill admin interface, we'll go back to our customer manager app. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and just rename the script here to something a little bit different. And so we'll go ahead and edit this to customer underscore add. Maybe we'll do PG for Postgres customer add. And then we'll say adds customer to PGDB. All right, so we'll say save draft. We'll deploy that to production. And then we'll go to our customer manager app right here. And what we want to do is just hit the little edit button right down here in the corner. And now when we click on this button, BTN new customer, we want to go ahead and select a script that's going to execute on click. So we'll go to workspace scripts. We only have one script, so we'll choose that. And over under the runnable inputs right here, we just need to connect first name and last name to the input fields that we have right here. So what we'll do is for the connection, we'll just hard code our PGDB connection. So that'll always be the same connection that we're going to use. And then for first name, we want to click the little plug icon to connect to txt firstname.result. That'll just get the text from that txt firstname box and feed it into the first name argument of our Postgres script. And then same thing for last name, we'll just click on the plug, we'll select txt lastname.result, and that'll take the value from the last name text box and feed it into the script. All right, so it's time to try everything out now that everything's been wired up from our user interface into our Postgres script. So what we're going to do is just say save draft, and we'll go over to the preview tab right here. And it looks like things are a little bit too spaced out here, so I'm going to reduce the size of these fields just a little bit. And then we'll grab these UI elements and just move them over a little bit just to keep things a little bit more succinct right here. We'll do save draft again, go back to preview here. And so now what we're going to do is plug in another name like Ruben Fizel, click on add new customer, and we didn't see any errors pop up. So what we're going to do is just go back to Beekeeper Studio right here, do a refresh, and as you can see, we've got Ruben Fizel right there inside of our database. Let's go ahead and try another name like Ruben Jones, click on add new customer again, do F5 to refresh, and now Ruben Jones is in there as well. The reason that we have these empty fields, even though we set non-nullable on these fields, is because if these boxes right here are empty and don't have any text, that actually equates to an empty string, and empty strings are not null values from the Postgres perspective. So an empty string is allowed, but a null value is not allowed in our customers table. So that's why we have those empty entries, because when I was moving this button around, I was actually clicking on it, and that was actually triggering it to run that SQL script with empty values right here. So make sure that if you are going to select an element during development here, try to click on it over under the component list on the left-hand side rather than selecting it right inside of the user interface, unless you're using this little move icon right here. So anyways, we've got a fully functional application here. We added a couple of UI elements. We added some interactivity by clicking a button. And we also spun up a PostgreSQL database using Docker on Linux. And that's a way for us to persist our customer data. Again, please subscribe to my channel, youtube.com/Trevor Sullivan. Go ahead and like this video as well, and leave a comment down below and let me know what you thought of this video. Thank you and take care.